Alright guys, welcome to Facebook. My name is Stephen Parker. I'm a user interface engineer here at Facebook. We're going to talk a little bit about XHP. It really hasn't garnered a lot of attention outside of Facebook, but it's changed the way that we've developed front-end code here. And so hopefully with this talk, you kind of can get an idea of why it's become so vital to development here. So I just want to go over a little bit about what XHP is, sort of the benefits it has to front-end development, give you a little intro on the basics of making XHP components and when to make them, and then finally how we've used XHP here at Facebook. So, XHP is a PHP extension which augments the syntax of the language such that XML document fragments become valid PHP expressions. What that means is that where we used to do a lot of string concatenation and we'd sanitize our inputs and echo that to the page, now we can straight up put XML document fragments into PHP with unsanitized input and safely render it to the page. XHP will process it so that your XML string is essentially converted to a PHP object, which has an array of attributes and then an array of children. This has a lot of big wins, mainly the parse time validation. So you no longer have to worry about invalid markup, forgetting to close your tags, mistyping an attribute name, any of that. All that will be validated on runtime. It automatically escapes all your input. So so you don't need to worry about XSS holds anymore. It's kind of a thing of the past. Security is now the default and not the exception. HTML elements can be stored and referenced, so you can reuse these components, you can reference them, you can pass them around through returns of functions, you can set their attributes through set attribute methods instead of having some sort of string regex pattern matching to see if the class name is available. Excuse me. And then you can easily build and reuse these components. Ooh, excuse me, I need a chair. So, these XHP elements, they look like this. Essentially, it's a PHP class creation with a colon appended in front of the name. So that's all you need to do, and all of a sudden your PHP object becomes an XHP element. You're then going to need to extend the core. Sorry. So you just, you extend the core XHP element, which is X element, and then I'll give you all your basic set attribute, get attribute, append child. All those methods will come for free with that. And then you create your render method, which it's a method you return core HTML and how your XHP element will be viewed on the page. So the attributes that you define on your XHP element. There's a lot of different things you can do for your attributes. If you prepend a colon in front of another XHP element, you're essentially saying here, you're going to extend all attributes available on that element. So here, this FB widget element is extending all attributes available on colon div. So you have onClick, you have ID and class, and on mouse down, all that stuff is now available on this element. You can also simple type your attribute declarations. So here we have string, but the other ones available are bool, int, float, enumeration, array, and var is a kind of a catch-all. And you can always declare an object type as well, just like a PHP function or method. You can set which attributes are required on the object, and then you can give default values to any attribute. So, children declarations run through sort of a regex pattern matching. So here we have just a question mark is 0 to 0 to 1, an asterisk is 0 to many, and a plus is 1 to many. And then we have 3 keywords that work as well. Empty, any, and is kind of a catch-all, and PC data is just straight text, or any variable that you passed in as a child. So, in this example here, we have an optional first image child, followed by at least one of an input element or an FB component element, and then a required third child. So the pattern matching is greedy. If you were to pass in an image followed by 2 inputs, this validation would fail because it would keep looping on the second match and never reach the required third child. And finally, XHP elements have categories, which is a way to, they're mostly used for children validation. So here in this example is how we validate that you cannot put a div inside a span, is by giving the span category inline and only allowing inline children. So all these methods are available on the XHP elements. You've got your getters and setters for attributes. You've got your remove attribute, get children, first and last child, append, prepend, replace. Category of just returns a Boolean on the XHP element. And we have the magic method toString, which just echoes your XHP element. And you can always do instance of just like any other PHP class. So, here is sort of the architecture of XHP and its core objects. Composable element is kind of the root object that all things extend from, and X element is what you're going to want to use when you create your object. The other side of that are the primitives, which essentially make up all the HTML elements themselves, the difference being that they return straight strings. So your X element will compose itself and return primitives, essentially. They can return X elements, which themselves will return primitives, but down the line, the primitives will be used to render out the actual strings to generate the markup. So XHP HTML element does all the validation to prevent XSS security holes and all that stuff. The last special case one is xfrag on the left, which essentially is a array for XHP. It's just a holder for you to put in XHP elements inside, and it won't actually render anything to the page. And if it's ever appended to another object, it just dissolves and appends its children instead. So, when to use these things? These are really just UI elements, UI data, a rendering layer object. So you may have a PHP object which holds all your data, and you want to render them in a consistent way to your page. You can create commonly used XHP components. Here we have an example of just a UI input, which is going to take a data object that you have throughout your site, let's say, and give it a property name. So you say, I want to input created from this property in this object. That way you can always give it a class name if you want to. You can have like required checks if you want to add some HTML5 required attributes in there. Or you can automatically populate this value if it's populated in the object. And the same thing goes with, I just created a gender select. Maybe it's a common gender select menu, which populates, male, female, or private, blank. And these things can be used to easily create just common elements on your site. So you can abstract this even further, and let's say we have a object here in Facebook called UI grid, which essentially creates a table. You assign a number of columns, and it'll split your children up and divide them into the appropriate rows. So here we have a UI grid with 4 children, the text being one, an element being another text, another element, and we're saying we want 2 columns on this table. Let's say we have some spacing attribute. We say I want a certain amount of spacing given by this element, defined by this element, and then we don't need any borders for this. And so the markup generated underneath, it will, in its render function, it's going to say, okay, give me the children, split them up into the number of columns, and then make rows for each item. And here's made make cells for each item. Here's made a cell for the name and a cell for the input, et cetera, et cetera. You can keep taking this up, so now it can become more than just one element here, one element there. But here you can make it more of a templating sort of framework. I just made this up. It's a common type of templating way of doing things where, let's say you create a template object, which is your page frame. You're going to populate it with certain layouts. So you have a left column, a middle column, and the ads on the right. Then you got to set all your variables you want applied inside these templates, and then you're going to display it. So instead of doing all this, because then all your logic is going to reside on these other files. They're going to reside in your homepage left column file, your homepage content file, your homepage ads file. Maybe they're all in the same file. But instead, here when you look at the page, you change it to XHP. We can say, okay, we have a Facebook page. Its layout is going to have a left column, it's going to have a content column, it's going to have an ads column. And inside those columns, we're going to say this is going to have the nav, this is going to have the chat there, the homepage is going to have the newsfeed header and the newsfeed, and the right-hand column is going to have its ads. And you can see directly right here what your page is going to look like without having to search through files or search through templates. You may not necessarily know what each of these are going to do, but you can give a general idea just by looking at the structure of the DOM tree. And in each one of these is probably something that looks very similar. So inside FB side nav, you're probably going to have a UL and it's going to have LIs, maybe abstracted into other components, but you can easily get a picture of how your page is going to look like at a glance from your code. So Facebook's UI library. We had this UI library a while ago, and it was good for what it did. It said, okay, every component, we want to compartmentalize all our CSS and all our objects. We don't really require more than we need. And so every one of these objects had its own CSS, and it was good. I mean, it worked. But we realized that a lot of these objects were duplicating the same CSS over and over again. They were saying, padding left 5 pixels to move each other away from each other, and it was bloat. We ended up having, at one point, more CSS rules defined on our homepage than actual DOM nodes. And so we said, okay, let's define the core CSS that all these elements are using and have them all just pull from that instead. So when we built our base UI object, we took margin and padding as 2 core attributes, and then all elements that we define will be extensions of that and have these 2 attributes applied. So now we have this div element, essentially, with small padding and a left medium margin. And what internally the object will do is add these classes here. We just put padding all S and margin left medium. And it applies that to any element you can create. So now in your CSS, when you're creating more objects, you don't need to go in and define these same things over and over and over again. That'll just add bloat. So we go one step further and say, okay, there's more that we're doing besides just spacing. Spacing may be common to all, but a lot of times engineers will come to a page and the designers come in and say, okay, here's what your page is going to look like. You're going to have a title here. You have some gray text here. And this will be bold. This will be however. So we said, okay, let's give the engineers the freedom to use that or to build that without having to rewrite the same things over and over again. So really what it was the font tag kind of reinvented. We're bringing back a way to give engineers a certain set that our designers have specified. These are our core allowable guidelines, essentially allowable colors, allowable font sizes or weights, and engineers can choose from that to build their element on the page. So in this example here, we just say, okay, we want a bold text with that's small and gray. And we add the classes, same thing as the spacing would do. And then display inline would just make it a span instead of a div. So using this, we started building on top of it, making other smaller, a little more complex components. Here we have what's called a UI image block, which is essentially just an image followed by text on the right. And it's a common paradigm that we see in a lot of websites these days. And here is the home page with all the image blocks highlighted. If all these components just simply reuse UI image block over and over and over again, they don't need to redefine the same CSS to put the same structure on the page. And so with all this, with the spacing and the text styling and these core elements that position things on the page, we were able to bring down the CSS usage from Facebook by 50% in 3 months. So coming, the homepage redesign back in February was our first big implementation of XHP, and it brought it down a good chunk. We had some right column cleanup with the ads and with the requests on the right and the events creation flows, and then we rewrote the entire newsfeed in XHP. All of this in 3 months was able to dramatically decrease the amount of CSS used on the page. So a lot of questions about XHP revolve around its speed and its optimizations. It is true that XHP is roughly 3 times slower with compared to basic string concatenation, but it turns out that that isn't actually that bad. When Marcel Laverdet, who actually was the original author and inventor of XHP, first built it, he kind of did a speed test against Facebook's current wall time, and he found that about 1 to 2% of the page generation time was string concatenation. And so building a library or a language that was a little slower in that sense wasn't that much of a hit. It didn't cause too much damage to our load time as it almost looks like on paper. Hip hop does help a little bit with that, but it's not necessary to really speed up your page. Most of your time is going to be spent still with data fetching and all that stuff, especially data writing. So people, a lot of comments that I've seen out on the web are about fear of basically slowing down or crashing your page because it just can't handle the number of, all the objects now are floating around instead of just straight string concatenation. But really, it's not that bad. You'll notice it if your web application is ultra light and doesn't even need to hit the database. But other than that, you're really pretty safe at using XHP over basic string concatenation methods. And then the other big win is just code clarity and brevity in a sense over maybe a tiny performance hit. The speed and ability with which we can develop now, reusing all these common elements, reusing common spacing, engineers can come in without knowing much about the UI, without knowing much about CSS, and come in and build these elements on the page in a really quick manner. And that's almost a bigger win than any performance that we would take from XHP as a language itself. It's dramatically increased and sort of changed the way people think about how they're building for Facebook. But yeah. So that's pretty much it. It's really a simple language. It's just XHP. It's just HTML, which if you're building for the web, you pretty much know already. So it's just being able to build your own elements and then use them on your page. There's not much to it than that. It's really easy to learn, and it's kind of once you start it, you can't go back. But yeah, do you guys have any questions about XHP, about how it's used? Do we need to give a mic?
So about 5 slides ago, you said that you're reinventing the font tag?
Yeah.
And that totally whizzed by me. I didn't see. Can you explain a little bit more about how that's happening here?
So essentially we're saying, the font tag was HTML like 1 spec, 2 spec. And it was a way for you, for inline, you could apply font color, font weight, font size to any text inside of it. And obviously, it's not a good paradigm. Doesn't really bode well with cascading style sheets. Doesn't separate style and content. So it was deprecated. But here we're saying it's really valuable sometimes for engineers to come in and say, I want this text to be gray. That's all I really care about. It doesn't matter that it, internally, like, I don't care if it's inline or abstracted out in some CSS file. Like, this just needs to be gray. And so here we're saying, okay, let's abstract that for you. We'll put it out in a CSS file. We'll put it out and say, okay, we'll define these classes of all the appropriate sizes, of all the appropriate font colors, and just give you the APIs to put them in for you. So what may essentially look like a font tag, it's saying UI Texas font color gray, isn't. But I mean, it's essentially the engineer can think of it that way without it actually mixing style and content. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I got it now. Thanks.
Can you talk about some more, you talked a little about image block and UI text. What are the other types of elements in the Facebook UI library? Starting with the simple ones and maybe on to some of the more complex ones. You have some more examples you can share?
Sure, we can just take a look at the homepage. So another very basic core component is UI like left-right. So you can see all of our headers have a left side. We have the header essentially, and a right we have an action, let's say. And that's another, basic component that, we're going to need to put something on the left, we need to put something on the right. So given an object, take two children, float one left, float one right, clear fix it, and you're done. An engineer, a lot of engineers they don't know what clear fix is. They don't know what floating is. They don't know how it takes out of the flow of context. So now they don't need to. All they need to know is they're going to use a UI left right, and it's going to space it for them magically. And then more basic ones you can see at the very bottom right. I have a little box that's telling me I have more notifications. Okay, engineers might want a box with borders, different colors. Warning, error box, a message, success, so info. And so we can, okay, we'll give them a box with different types, an error box and a warning box. And so now they don't need to know like what color is the yellow that we use, what color is the gray that we use, or the blue or green, whatever. And we can always change that color, and they won't even know. All they just know is UI box type equals success. As you start building up, you want to abstract these out into more higher level elements. So here we have a million UI boxes on the page, but if you look at the center column, it's a list of UI boxes. So you can see 3 here on them. Each story is its own UI element essentially, but it's going to have a lot of metadata with it. So we want to abstract each of these stream stories out and say, this is a stream story object, and it will return a UI image, but maybe it's going to take in more data specific information. So it's going to take in a stream object data type, and say it's going to pull out the user profile picture, the message, any comments, things like that, and it'll just pull that out and then start generating UI image blocks. And as I mentioned very briefly, kind of the templating. I'll go back a little bit. So here, we have a news feed which has a story. So each of those stories are going to, essentially be an array of these story object types. So you can keep bubbling it up and kind of abstracting it out until you get to the page level. When XHP comes through and renders, it renders it kind of top to bottom. So it's going to say, okay, it's going to FB page, and it's going to run its render method, which will return. It'll return, let's say a div with left column, right column, center column, and then it's going to look inside those and render those and recursively go down the tree. So as you get to FB newsfeed, it's going to render it and see, okay, you're now returning a list of FB newsfeed story objects. It's going to render that and return a list of UI image blocks and render that, which is going to return a div with an image and text. And that's kind of how XHP processes itself as it goes down to render your page. Does that answer your question? Is there any?
Can you talk about some more examples of things that are in the Facebook's like specific UI, reusable UI components? You talked a little about left-right. Are there any more complicated components?
There are tons of complicated components. We have the type ahead at the top of the page is probably one of the more complicated components. We use that in a lot of places. We use it for in your edit profile flow. We use it here in creating events. Is mentions uses a type ahead, which is like tagging people in your status. It's another component where engineer doesn't need to know all the advanced JavaScript that goes with it for internationalization, for caching, your names of your friends, and all that stuff. They just say, okay, I want a UI type ahead, and I want it to show 10 results, and I want it to pull from, friends or friends in the pages I like, and things like that, and then I want to store, when I press enter, I want it to send the results to this endpoint. It's like I said, it really simplifies an engineer's ability to code for the web without having to know about the specifics of the web. I'm trying to think if there's what other components we have on this page here. The side nav on the left is another component, so we just have a generic side nav that we'll use through a lot of different places. And this, it's just another example where they say, okay, I want a side nav, I want it to load asynchronously data into the content column. Here are all my choices, and here's my selected one. Now render it for me. That's all they really need to know. They don't need to know about any sort of IE6 quirk that comes along when you display it in a certain way or any of that sort of stuff, because the component sort of knows itself what it needs to do. We do other things as well. Another kind of little fancy trick we do is in a list. Say we want a list floated left to right. In RTL languages, we could just float it right to left, but there are bugs with IE7 that when you float things left inside floating things right, it does all sorts of display issues. So we say, okay, we'll just flip the order of the images, or the order of the items in the list, and float them in the left still. So all that sort of fancy stuff an engineer isn't going to know about. They're going to say, here's a list of my items, I need floated left to right. So we have, let's say this yes, no, maybe, or yes, maybe, no on your sponsored ad that you're applying to the event. It's probably floated each item to the left. When we change it to an RTL locale, it'll be reversed, but not be because the images are floated right, or the radio buttons are floated right, but because we've reversed the order of the items. And as an engineer, if they were building a page, they may not even test in RTL, or they may not know about the RTL issues in IE7 specifically. So here we've avoided that without really having to do any extra work.
Anyone else have any other questions?
Hi. You talked about the performance mostly in the terms of engineer performance. It makes things quicker for engineers to do work. You also mentioned a little bit about how it makes the site slightly slower. But you didn't say much about the XSS and protection as the other features that it kind of gives you. Is there anything else to say on that? It's perfect in that regard?
It essentially sanitizes all attribute inputs and all children inputs. I mean, I'm scared to say the word perfect, but there's always ways you can engineer internally. Like you could build a way in your own instance of XHP to get around the security flaws. It's not like absolutely foolproof, but as a base, you can just throw in anything you want, and it's going to essentially run it through HTML special characters to return your input. So it's going to prevent any way that you yourself could even implement a XSS hole, let alone like user-generated input. It becomes the default.
I've got another question.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about this creating essentially a big string after you've rendered it, because you're talking about walking down the tree, and ultimately it gives you a string.
Mm-hmm.
So at what level are you kind of generating these strings? Because I'm assuming you're not generating the entire page is one big string, because the whole of the Facebook site is very dynamic. So how do you deal with the sort of dynamism in markup and XHP? How do you generate fragments of pages?
So, well, here we have a fragment right here. So let's say in this page they had some form, and they're inputting the username and the gender. And let's say this is a function actually. So instead of echo, it's return HTML. And this function is, get user form, get user create form. Here we're passing around just an xfrag, and a user might call this function to say, okay, I need to get this form. I mean, technically that should be its own XHP element. It should be a user create form element that you'd pass around. But it in itself is kind of a little fragment. And so essentially, all XHP elements are themselves fragments, except for maybe the highest of levels of the page element. And a good paradigm we use is just to try and make them kind of as small as possible. Each element should do kind of as little as it needs to, and just keep it very specific to its own purpose. So, I mean, yeah, it's just kind of separate, keeping everything simple to understand. The processing, what happens when you are building, but trying to get back to your question, the sort of the loop it goes through when we are jittering this content, it doesn't always do it in one big swoop. We still have a lot of old non-XHP code in our system, so a lot of our things will have been upgraded but are still kind of in the transitional phase. So we may still have functions that return XHP, or we may still have functions that return strings, but we want to make sure that that string is HTML safe. So we'll update the function to return XHP, or sorry, to use XHP, but return its string. So we'll render it and return that rendered string instead of the whole XHP block. So, I mean, the processing may not happen all at once, but it can. It just depends on how you build your system. I'm not sure if that answered your question fully.
Yeah, to add to that, it sort of just like iterates over the XML and just two strings everything as it goes, right?
Yeah, it actually, technically what it will do is it'll loop through it until it reaches primitives. It'll boil it down all the way down to its primitives, because when you validate children, you're going to put, UI image block, let's say, is going to validate its child, saying it needs an image as the first child, and the next child can be anything. But I guess a better example would be a table. So UI grid is going to say it can have any number of children, and I'm just going to separate it into cells. But a table is going to say, I need a TR as my child, a TR is I need TDs as my children. And so when you use UI grid and you render it, it's going to generate a table with TRs as children. As it goes through the rendering, it's going to say, okay, render, return table. We have to stop there because the children of the UI grid aren't TRs. So we need to render the children of the UI grid first, essentially. Basically the idea is that all X primitives have their own children validation. So spans requiring only inline elements, tables requiring only TR elements. We're going to boil all X elements down to those primitives first, so that we can use the HTML native validation, and then we'll again sort of loop through it and render all those to strings. The X primitives are the only ones that actually return strings.
The documentation is pretty bad so far. In fact, most of it that I've found has been just other people blogging about their experiences with XHP. Do you guys have any plans to create some better documentation about the language?
So XHP has been open source for maybe 6 months or so. I'm not exactly sure the exact date. And it's kind of, not to say that it's out of our hands now to document, but it's kind of out of our hands. Yeah, I mean, it's Marcel created it and he open sourced it, and he put some documentation when he built it, but he knows how to use it, so it's like it wasn't a huge incentive. I mean, it's tough. I mean, on the front, it's very simple. It's just XML, and then you just have to learn the syntax of creating these elements to use them. But I guess I encourage anyone else there out using it who's having trouble, and they're trying to build it in their own web applications, and they're hitting roadblocks and not understanding things to, post to the GitHub or any other blogs you've mentioned about having problems, and just sort of try and use the open source nature of it to increase the documentation. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's important enough to have a tech talk about it, right? And so you obviously want to tell people, so it'd be nice to let more people other than the 30 in this room have access to it.
The question behind you.
Yes, to piggyback to him, at least provide some example of code and rendering, that is kind of things. I think maybe you can guess a little snippet that you have.
I'm not really pressured to go on to the project and add some documentation. We have internal documents to help our own engineers build these components, so I'm sure there is nothing private in there that we can't share. But yeah, I mean it's definitely something that is not without our realm of ability.
So we ask.
Are there any other questions? Or anyone from online? Yeah, and I highly encourage you to go and check out XHP and download it, install it onto your server, play with it a little bit, just see how it can transform sort of the way you build your web applications, and think about how you build your web applications. It's really transformed a lot of the code we write here at Facebook. And yeah, I mean, I really think that this is sort of the direction that web programming is going. It's a different paradigm of thought, and I don't know, it's exciting to be in the forefront of it, and I have been disappointed, I guess, a little bit at the lackluster response, but you're probably right that the documentation has not been up to snuff enough for people to really understand the full power of XHP. So again, I encourage you to check it out and just give it a shot. Oh, question coming in. Oh, but I think there's another question back here somewhere. Or maybe not.
Do you know offhand if there are any 5.3 PHP 5.3 limitations?
I do not believe there are. I know XHP has been implemented into PHP 5.3, so the only thing I can think of is namespacing. We have sort of XHP allows you to sort of faux namespace your elements. So UI grid is, looks like it's namespace, but it's actually not. It's just the XHP process version of this looks like XHP __ UI _ grid is the name of the PHP object. Having it work with PHP 5.3 namespaces, I would put strong money on that it does, but I have never actually tried it myself.
So another question is, when it reaches the child element, how exactly does it fetch the appropriate content and insert it in order to build the string? So can you go over the process of converting, FB widget there to an actual, how does that thing turn into a string?
Okay. So let's say we, new FB widget, and then we said echo. So what it's going to do, the toString magic method is going to come in and say, okay, call the render method on this XHP element, and that will say it has some more processing than this simple example, but it'll return this XHP element again. So it's going to take that return and say, okay, I'm still in XHP, so call render again. This time it's calling render on a primitive. So
can you talk about what a primitive is versus what a regular XHP element is, real quick?
So yeah, I'll go back to. once I get there. So a primitive, yeah, the two sides are primitive and X elements. Primitives are everything that returns a string. So these ones, they're render methods, essentially return strings, whereas X element render methods return XHP. So when you're recursively calling render, like I said, it stops at primitives, so it won't actually render the primitive until the whole tree is kind of primitives. So
What are some examples of primitives?
HTML elements. HTML elements are all the primitives. You don't ever really create primitives yourself. You can if you had a specific need for it. But essentially, I mean, that's where you might shoot yourself in the foot with XSS holes, is if you try to do something like that. But all the HTML elements are already built in for you with XHP into a PHP lib file. So it's kind of, you don't necessarily need to worry about it, but it's there. And these are just the things that will build the strings for you. What you need to worry about is returning XHP inside your render methods, and then it'll recursively melt itself down into strings for you. Does that make sense? Online person?
Yes. We'll just go with yes. It does. Good, thank you. Are there any Facebook XHP libraries available for developing FB apps?
I want to go with no.
Yeah. I don't think so.
Yeah, we only really have our internal UI library. FBML and the like may look similar, but it's not XHP. I'm not sure. The social widgets we have, there's no real correlation between Facebook's UI library and any third-party application.
Do you think in the future it would be cool to offer some Facebook-specific XHP library?
I suppose. I mean, it's nothing. Technically, it's all there. If you look at our HTML and CSS generated, you can kind of figure it out. We're using the same class names over and over and over again now, so it's not that hard. But yeah, I don't see anything out of the realm of reason why we would, be opposed to that. Any more questions here or online?
See any online?
Well, all right. I'll stick around for a little bit if you have any more questions. But again, highly encourage you to check this out and just play with it, get a feel for it, see what it can do for you. Thanks.